Well, hello everyone and welcome to Oh Yum. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a Tuesday evening in the southern part of Ontario in Niagara. And before we get going and to let people come on in and join this live stream, I'd like to do my shout outs and hellos to everyone. So Mom, Dad, Michino, hello to you. Kathy, I know you're gonna be watching later. Bonnie down the street is watching. Usually Raf or T is joining us. Suzanne sometimes joins and Mika is joining. So Mika, Esme, John, so glad you could join me for a little bit. And I've got a fun recipe to share. So this is my Baking Wisdom series, and it's a combination of live streams and recorded videos. That way we can keep something coming to you regularly. And these are all recipes from my brand new cookbook called Baking Wisdom. Now I know I've seen some of you already drop in on the chat thread and tell me you've got your copy, even in Western Australia. Jan, that is amazing that you got your copy delivered. And so hopefully you've had a chance to peruse it. It's a heavy book. It weighs 5 pounds. I don't even have the book out. What am I doing? Here it is. I always have a copy hanging around. And as any good author will tell you, you always have a case in your car too. This is Baking Wisdom. And today's recipe is a bit of an adventure. We're making a bread, but it's not really a bread. It is definitely a decadent treat. I'm making Swedish Semlor, which are a cardamom-spiced bun filled with a marzipan cream. And typically this was originally served at Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, right before Lent started. Then I get the feeling it was extended beyond that. And in my book, it is so good. I love it so much. I say we make it year round. So I wanted to share this recipe for semlor. It's got some delicious flavors, some interesting techniques. And just as a note, before I get into the recipe, if you don't have a copy of Baking Wisdom, you will find the complete recipe for today's dish right below on the screen. You just have to open it up, show me more, and there it is. Additional to that, you can go to Premier Collectibles from anywhere in the world and order a signed copy of my book. They ship anywhere in the world. Of course, your shipping cost depends on where you live because it is shipped out of the United States. You can also go to Amazon in Canada or the US, Indigo here in Canada. You've got lots of options. So a different way for us to hang out. This time with a cookbook in your kitchen. But let's get started on today's recipe, Swedish Semlor. Now in Scandinavian baking particularly, cardamom is a common spice ingredient. Cinnamon appears, nutmeg appears, but cardamom is typically highlighted, and that's what I love about this bun recipe. I've already measured my flour into my bowl, and you can see here, I've got 2 full teaspoons, 10 ml of ground cardamom. This is ground black cardamom. You could use green cardamom if you wanted. It's got a bit of a different perfume. If you're new to cardamom, it's a spice that kind of reminds you of black pepper without being quite as hot, but with a citrus lemon zest character to it. I've also got my salt measured here. And interestingly, even though this is a yeast bread, and I am adding my yeast, it also calls for baking powder. And I was puzzling over it, and I was doing some research, and while some semlor recipes, the more contemporary ones, have egg in them, the older, more classic semlor recipes use no egg, but they have the added baking powder. So I figure one is a replacement for the other. And you think about it, a long time ago, before we had artificial light, eggs were more of a springtime thing. When the weather warmed up, there were longer days, and you have to think, ooh, mid-February in Sweden, bet there wasn't a whole lot of bright sunshine happening. So I can understand why this would be an eggless dough, but yet it is sweet and it is rich. I'm adding my 7 grams of instant dry yeast, which means I can add it directly to the flour. Oh, and I can't forget my little bit of sugar. It makes the dough a bit sweet, but not too sweet. And I'll get this bit of sugar that I spilled on the work table. There we go. There we go. I'll give that a little stir. And, oh, Mika, thanks for your kind words about the book. And Chris, anyone can attend cooking school at any time in their life. It's interesting, a good friend of ours who's just recently retired has decided he wants to go to culinary school so he can volunteer for programs like Meals on Wheels. And so if the passion is there, the interest is there, source out a program that suits your needs. You can probably fast track and specialize as you want. You can also audit classes if you're not actually pursuing a diploma or a degree. My husband, Michael, who's running all these fabulous cameras, teaches at a culinary school. So we can speak from experience. That's a great question. Hello, Christine, watching from Sydney, Australia. Annabelle, who's joining us. And as I'm answering Annabelle's question, where I'm from, I'm going to add my warmed milk and melted butter to this recipe. So typical to an enriched dough. When you add milk and butter, you're adding richness, yes, but you're adding softness. So you're going to end up with a slightly sweet bun that has a very thin and delicate crust. And I'll start the mixer. And Annabelle, I am from Niagara. So that is about 90 minutes from Toronto. So I'm on the Canadian side, but I'm 30 minutes from Buffalo. So very close to the US-Canada border. And the person who influenced me most to become a baker was my grandmother when I was a kid and growing up. And I used to visit her not 30 minutes away from here. Had no idea I would end up living here. I've been here for, oh gosh, Michael, how long has it been? More than 25 years, almost 30 years. Okay, change of topic. Now, I'm going to slowly let this dough come together. It will feel different. If you've made a rich dough before, if you've made a dough to make cinnamon buns, it can feel fluffy. Because there is no egg in this recipe, it does feel a little more dense. You're still doing right by the recipe. So just stick with the measurements. I know you'll do fine. Oh, hello from Carol in Ville-Marie in Quebec. And good question, CJ. How long do you need this dough in the machine? I've got it on low speed, and once I've kind of lifted up most of the flour, I can turn up the speed a notch. And it doesn't take as long as, say, a white dough, or like a baguette, or a white bread, or a whole wheat loaf, because you don't need to develop the proteins in the flour like you do other recipes. So we're gonna give it a good spin, but really, I'm only gonna sit here and chat with you for about 2 minutes, and then we'll be able to stop the mixer. So I'm just waiting until everything comes together. I can see I've got the wet dough has kind of climbed up the hook a little, so I'm gonna flip it around, put it towards the bottom, and this will take a little less time then. You can make this dough, of course, by hand. It does come together rather tightly so that it's not sticky to touch and you can knead it by hand. So if you're making this dough by hand, what you want to do is bring the dough together until it's too hard to mix. Then you turn it out on your work surface, and then you kind of start kneading it. And it takes virtually about the same time. Where for a regular bread dough, I would give it 5 to 8 minutes. And we're talking 3 to 5 here. So great questions. Oh, Juna is back. Well, good morning to you. If you are joining me from Australia or Southeast Asia, I know it's early morning, and I thank you for joining me. Others of you are joining me from across Canada and the States, some even in Europe because it's later in the evening or you're staying up a little bit. Chris is asking, how did Michael and I meet? Well, Michael was executive chef of the restaurant where I was pastry chef. So we truly fell in love in the kitchen. And yes, Paula, you're bringing up a very good point. There are 456 pages. I had to weigh this book just to see. It weighs 5 pounds. So that's almost 2 kilos. Or no, just under, or, yeah, just over 2 kilos. That's a big book. And you can see how the dough has now come together. And it is a drier style dough without being dry. because don't forget, you have that little bit of sugar in there that kind of dissolves. And so I'm letting it just sort of bop around the mixer. Oh, Snow Sam is asking a great question. Michael's going to love this question. So is Mika, who's watching. Wondering if I've ever made vina tarta. Yes, you can. I have recipes out there, not here on the Oh Yum channel, but I made the lovely Mika's wedding cake, and it was a gigantic vina tarta wedding cake. So for those of you who are not Icelandic or of Icelandic descent, it is a recipe of a cardamom shortbread torte. We do a minimum of 7 layers, and then it's got a cardamom and cinnamon prune filling layered between it. So you layer the shortbread with the prune filling, one over the other, but they're thin layers, and so it sits about this high. And then what you want to do is actually wrap it and freeze it, so those shortbread layers soften up, and then it slices cleanly. And look, I can just see Michael's face. He's smiling and nodding his head because he knows it so well. You make it for special occasions, birthdays, weddings. You would make it at Christmas time. It's a celebratory treat. So it's almost like the Icelandic version of fruitcake. Oh, but Michael says, but better. So I'm just going to give this a final knead. And I want you to get a good look at how this is a denser style of dough, yet strangely soft at the same time. Oh, and I'm glad you received the book already. Hello to Karen from Texas. I'm just keeping an eye on the thread just so I can catch any questions you might be asking, especially Dee from Cape Town in South Africa. Oh, and Snow Sam's saying, yes, I should do a vina tarta on Oh Yum. Okay, I'm going to put that on the list. I still have quite a few things to do. We've got Michael, we've got people joining us from Texas and Missouri and Portugal. And River's been watching since my sugar days. That was the very first television show I ever did. And we won't talk about how long ago that was. And hello from Jordan. It's amazing to see you all joining me. If you're just signing in, I am making Swedish Semlor. This is a decadent cardamom-spiced bun filled with a marzipan filling. So now I've got my dough. As you can see, it's not terribly sticky. Put it down on the table. Oh, I have to put it down, Michael says. Put the dough down. But I'm going to bring in the one that I have already let rise for 90 minutes. So when you add, even though yeast feeds on sugar, when you add a complex sugar like granulated sugar as opposed to, say, something like honey, it can actually take longer for dough to rise because the yeast has to break down that sugar, turn it into simple sugar, and then it feeds on it, and then it lets off the carbon dioxide that lifts your dough up. So I find this dough can take 90 minutes to rise, and it doesn't always double in size even after 90 minutes. But you can stop after 90 minutes. And here we've got my risen dough, and I find, you got a sense of the texture of that dough before it went in the bowl to rise. I'll just swap out new dough, old dough. So it does lift, but it still stays a little dense. But don't worry, these buns are anything but dense. But I find when I'm rolling the dough and handling the dough, I don't have to use a whole lot of flour on my work surface. It's not tacky or sticky. So I've got my tray, and this recipe makes 12 buns. So what I've learned, I don't speak Swedish, but semlor is plural, semla is singular. So we've got, I'll cut this into 12 individual semla, and then as a collection, they're semlor. So to do that evenly, you can pull out your scale for this, but I find it easy to cut it into 4 pieces, relatively equal, and then divide each of those into 3. Is my placement okay, Michael, so everyone can see what I'm doing? All right. Shaping buns was one of my favorite things to do when I was pastry chef and when I owned a bakery. It's a bit of a Zen, relaxing activity. I'm keeping an eye on the, oh, here's a good question. Is there any difference between, this is from Fernanda, between instant dry yeast and active dry yeast? Active dry yeast, if it's the larger granules, needs to be dissolved in liquid before you add it to the flour. The instant dry yeast is a finer granule and it dissolves. You can just mix it into the flour. That makes it kind of protected, temperature protected and protected from the salt, which makes it easier to work with. So that's the only difference. And if you're using fresh yeast, you want to double the weight. So where you see the recipe calls for 7 grams, then you want 14 grams of fresh yeast. And so I've already started rolling. So what we want to do is turn a funny, odd shape like this into something that is beautifully round and sits up. And so that means we almost want to create a taut surface on the skin. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm pulling the dough, I'm flattening it, and then I'm bunching it up so this now becomes the bottom of the bun, and I put that on my work surface, and then you want to twist. So this is, you don't want to flour your work surface when you do this. You actually want the dough to stick a little bit. And with the side of your palm, you draw it down, and then you push it up. And I'm not just spinning the bun around in a circle like this. I'm actually kind of pulling the bun so that it develops this round shape and taut skin on the surface, like so. And you can leave plenty of space. So I have to do this 10 more times, so you'll get lots of chance for me to do this. Oh, good question. Judy says, does the instant dry yeast take a shorter time for the dough to rise? Not substantially. A little bit. In early days when instant yeast came out, it was always said you could use less yeast than, less instant yeast than regular dry active, but I find 1-to-1, it's still the same. Time is always working for you in terms of developing flavor and developing a really good texture to your bread. So you don't really want to cheat too much. Now, once you get the hang of rolling your bread a little more, here's a good dexterity test. You can do 2 at once. That's when you have to do 200 Semlor for an order, special order. But you know what? I'm going to take a few moments, if I could, while I'm making these beautiful cardamom buns, take a look at people's questions. Oh, good question, Raf. I do love rolling dough on a wood surface. That's ideal because it holds an even temperature. And it's got a natural texture that seems to, when it comes to rolling butter pastry and bread doughs, keeps it it doesn't stick as easily. And then you're not adding as much flour. A granite surface is so smooth. Sometimes it's even shiny. It can take a little extra flour to get it rolling. And that's temperature aside. Even puff pastry, I prefer rolling on wood as opposed to marble. The benefit of marble and granite is it does stay cool. So if you're in a hot climate, you might find that your pastry rolling benefits from getting a marble or granite. You don't have to get the whole the countertop, but at least a cutting board or work surface you can work on if you're doing a lot. Chris made sugar cookies the other night. Recipe said roll and, oops. Chris and his cookies weren't baking. They didn't move. They stayed in a ball shape and they were dry and sandy. Was this my recipe? I hope it wasn't. It sounds like a little extra flour got added to the recipe, maybe by accident. I would hope that wouldn't happen. So if you can let me know a little more, I'd love to hear. Oh, and River's asking as a chef, what is the most challenging thing I've ever made? I'd say the most challenging thing I've ever had to master were macarons. There's a reason you learn them later in your baking apprenticeship because the ingredients are super simple, almonds, sugar, and egg whites, but it is all in the technique and you have to understand and appreciate technique. So once I master that, and there is a great recipe in Baking Wisdom for macarons because when I first learned to make them, I was using the French method because it's all based on the meringue. So a French meringue is just whip your egg whites and sugar, and I would do them. Then I was finding that was a little finicky. So I moved into the Italian macaron, which involves boiling sugar and water together, adding that to your meringue. So you're making an Italian meringue. A little more stable, a little more predictable. But then I started playing with the Swiss macaron method. So you just warm the egg whites and sugar together. Oh, and I found that was just so easy, and you could tell when you hit the right point of your macaronage just so perfectly. So you can find that recipe in Baking Wisdom. Oh, Tammy, great question. How does higher elevation work when it comes to letting your yeast dough rise? Now, this is a very good point. So Tammy, what you definitely want to do at a higher altitude, and I don't know where you live, here in Canada, the city that gets impacted the most, large city that gets impacted the most would be Calgary, Alberta, because it's 1,000 meters above sea level. And so you do get a little bit of altitude difference. I'm gonna set these aside for a nap while I finish answering that question. So quickly, when it comes to high altitude, what you're dealing with is lower air pressure. The higher up you are, the lower the air pressure, which means in terms of baking, less resistance. So your baking powder, your yeast, your baking soda has less pressure to fight against, so things rise up really quickly. But because a recipe was designed for sea level, those ingredients don't bond at the same rate. And so what happens? Things lift up and then they collapse. And so you'll see a lot of breads might sink or not lift up because they just can't, they'll lift up and collapse as they're baking. Cakes may sink in the middle. So the key things you want to do to bake at high altitude, and I do have a whole page on that in Baking Wisdom. First thing you want to do is reduce your leavening. So reduce your yeast that you're adding to your breads. And you want to increase your liquid a little bit because that gives your ingredients more room to move as they find out where they belong and bond together. And then you can consider, it's not always advisable, especially for something super sweet, but you can consider increasing your oven temperature slightly. Just by 5 degrees Celsius, maybe 10, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, just to get those ingredients moving and setting a little bit faster. So I hope that answers your question. So now, I've planned ahead for this. I was ready for you joining us. I've got a batch of Semlor already risen. So after you cover them with a tea towel, now with a typical bread, you would probably give it about 30 minutes after shaping and then bake it. But for this recipe, because of its density, I give it a full hour. If you wanted to, you could make the dough ahead of time, chill it overnight, and then shape it the next morning. Then you would have to give it a good 2 hours to lift up. Now I've got my egg wash. Here we go. We want to give these little cardamom buns a bit of shine, but you don't want to put anything on top. We're going to dust them with icing sugar afterwards. So just a little egg mixed with a touch of water adds that shine. Oh, good, Tammy. I'm glad I could help you out with that. Oh my goodness, Diane, you live at 8,400 feet. That is dramatic. Do you live in the Rocky Mountains? When I went to cooking school in Vail, Colorado, and that was 8,400 feet above sea level. And then if you got up to the top of the mountain, which is actually where I took my classes, in the ski chalet, in the off season when it wasn't being used, it was really, really a cool experience. So we were at 10,000 feet above sea level. So we would bring in guest pastry chefs to teach us during school, and they got a really fast lesson in high altitude baking. Let me tell you, we all learned a great deal, hands-on experience. I have preheated my oven to 350, and these take about 25 minutes. It's up to you if you want to run your convection fan, if you have one. If you're going to run it, put it on a low setting because you don't want to promote too much browning on your buns before the inside is cooked. Nico lives in Calgary, and now you've got a good handle on why things turn out differently. And of course the ingredients are different too, country to country. And I spend a lot of time talking with people about that because you're joining me, I know, from all over the world, and our flours are different, our butters are different, our dairy is different. Here, let me pop these in. I am going to set my timer just so I can show you the buns. We may not, I may be done before these are actually coming out, but we'll see here. I'll set it for 20. Can you remind me, Michael, if just to, okay, good. So now we've got buns in the oven, and of course, we're not gonna sit around for 20 minutes and wait. I have some already baked. So when they come out of the oven, this is what they look like. Oh, hello from Kuala Lumpur. My brother-in-law and his wife are there right now. Isn't that so cool? Jalana Lore, the street with all the great street food. Oh my gosh, I miss it. It's been ages since I've been there. Chili crab. Chili crab. So this is the lovely bun. You can see the nice round shape. Now what we want to do is get them ready to fill, because a traditional semlor is filled with a marzipan cream filling. So I didn't want you to watch me do this 12 times over, but I did want to show you what I like to do is we need to cut the top of the bun off. If you've done filled cupcakes, you would do the same thing. And then you pull that off, and then what we want to do is actually cut into the bun a little bit. You don't want to go all the way through. So I've got a knife, a paring knife. It's got a hint of a serrated edge. And then there is no glamorous way to do this, but you want to pull out a good amount. The more space you have in the middle of your bun, the more room for cream filling. So make a little space, but try not to tear through the bun. And this is where that sort of soft richness of the bun helps. If you were just doing a regular bun, it would all shred and the bun would tear. There we go. So now I've got a lot of space. Now what I do is I don't throw away this, the crumb filling. I'm going to work that into the cream with the marzipan. It's got this beautiful cardamom flavor, and that gives the cream some body, so you can make these ahead, pipe them, and they'll hold their shape. I'm gonna set this aside, and I have to bring back the mixer for a minute. I haven't gone far. Here we go. So now it's time to make the filling. You let me know, Michael, if my positioning is okay. I'm just going to set these off to the side because I've got my filling ingredients to show you. So this is 2 cups of, by volume, of the inside fillings that I pulled out of the semlor. I've got some marzipan, and I've got a little bit of milk. So you can do this with electric beaters if you want. It's not a highly technical moment, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all those crumbs, the reserved crumbs, in the mixer, and I want to soften them up with some of the milk. I'll let that sit for a second. And now I've got my little marzipan, and you'll see, free with purchase, that in addition to the semlor recipe, at the bottom of the page, you'll see I've also included my recipe for homemade marzipan. Because I find, depending on the time of year, you can't always find marzipan. Around here, because I live in Southern Ontario, I find usually the marzipan is sold covered in chocolate. Well, that doesn't help me. I need baking marzipan, or sometimes it's got food coloring added to it. So I like making my own. And the ingredients, if you look below, you'll see are super simple. It's ground almonds, sugar, a touch of honey, and a little water. You can add almond extract if you want. That's another reason I like to make my own. Sometimes the commercial marzipan has too much almond extract added to it. So depending how you want to use it, you can control it. You boil the sugar and honey, you bring it up to a boil, you pour it in the food processor with the almonds, and that's it. You've made marzipan. I didn't choose to do it today simply because it just makes a whole lot of racket with the food processor. All right. Oh, Byron is asking a good question. So back to proofing bread. Is proofing bread really difficult? It's not. Once you've done it once, you'll really get a good sense of what the growth is. So as I pointed out, with a bun like this that has sugar in it, it's a slower proof time. It's also more forgiving because you've got butter and the sugar in there, where a regular yeast bread with simply like a baguette recipe, you have to read it more carefully. The ingredients are simpler and it's more temperature sensitive. If you overproof bread, meaning you've let it go too long, you forgot about it, and it rises up, the yeast has done its feeding, there's no more carbon dioxide, what happens? Oh, the bread collapses. You can re-knead the bread and start again if you miss that point. And then you set the timer from the first point. If you do it twice though, well, now the yeast has nothing to feed off of. You'll have to add a little more yeast to get it going again. So I hope that's a good, quick answer to your question. Kelby's asking, can I use honey in place of corn syrup? It really depends on the recipe. In baking, in a lot of cases, yes, you can. If maple syrup is an option, consider that as well. While we're talking, I'm breaking the soft marzipan into pieces, and I'm just creating a bit of a paste between the bread pieces, the milk I added to soften the bread up, and then I'm breaking up the marzipan a little bit. Chris, you must be Ontario-based, is asking, does Michael recommend George Brown Culinary Management in Toronto? So you're in Toronto? Yes. Oh, yeah, it's a very good school. One of our dear friends, what was his position? He just retired recently. Director. It has long been, it's where Michael went to school and graduated from. So clearly, you got some good eggs come out of George Brown College. But of course, Michael's going to say Niagara College is better. And Lo is asking, is this full fat milk or cream? Well, for the dough, the bread dough, I used 2% milk, 2% milk fat. I do have 2 cups of, or 500 ml of whipping cream whipped for the filling. And so I'm just making sure this is nice and smooth. Before we go, just paying attention here. So I've already whipped my whipping cream, added a touch of sugar and vanilla. And before I transfer this to a bowl, something I like to do is, this sounds funny, but I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of the cream just to soften up this base mixture a little more. I don't want to add more milk because then I'll have a filling that might not hold its shape or volume. But I'm just going to add, that's about a half a cup, so 125 ml. And it's okay if that deflates in there. So we're not at the folding stage yet. And this allows me to really smooth it out. Oh yeah. Because it depends on your marzipan, right? You know how some marzipan can be a little bit firm or a little bit grainy, and some can be really soft and smooth. And marzipan is typical to Swedish Semlor. And if you're just joining us now, well, hello, thanks for coming by. We're making Swedish Semlor, which if you've never tried them before, once you do, you understand why they are so popular in Sweden. So now I've got a nice soft base here, and I just so you can see better, transfer this to a bigger bowl. Get all that good marzipan. Now, actually, I should put a question out to you. We were talking about marzipan and almond extract. Who here is a fan of almond extract? I find people are very split. Some people love it, and then some people not so much. How do you feel about almond extract? Oh, Hazel's asking a good question on that marzipan topic. Does it freeze well? It will, well wrapped, because of the sugar content. Well wrapped, it should stay soft and fresh, you know, for a good month to 6 weeks, the homemade stuff. And then anything beyond that, I would say yes, it would freeze quite well. It should stay nice and soft because of the sugar. So that's a very good question. Now, Yezi is asking, can you substitute the marzipan with something else? That's a good question. Although marzipan is typical, if you have a nut allergy or it's not to your liking, I would simply say leave it out. You've got the cardamom filling in the center of the buns to give it some substance and flavor. Maybe a pinch of cinnamon, but you don't want to override the cardamom in there. So I think you're safest just leaving it out. You would still soak the breadcrumbs though in the milk to soften them up. That way they break down. And so now I'm finishing folding in the cream. And just as a reminder, the cream does have some vanilla in there. It's okay to have a bit of texture in these buns because of the pieces we've added, and that's part of its enjoyment. I have seen recipes where people will spread a little marzipan in the bottom of the bun and then just simply pipe whipped cream on top. So if you're running short on time, I would say that's an option for you too. KS likes almond extra, but not loving it. People are, we've got a yes, we've got the smell, and in the right place. Chris, you've got a good point. Well placed. I think almond extract belongs well. For some reason, I love almond extract with cherry desserts. Just a thing, that's to me. We got some loving, almond extract loving. Well, that's because we're all bakers. And if you like European style baking, almond extract figures prominently, so you start to become accustomed to it a little bit. So we are getting close to the finish line here on our semlor. But don't worry, I'm not disappearing too quickly. I've got my piping bag fitted with a large star tip, and in goes the filling. Now, I know this makes a lot of cream filling, and it really depends how much you spoon out from your semlor, how much room you have for the filling. But we're not filling to hide the cream. We actually want to show off the cream. So let me start with this. I can always top up later. And you know Bonnie down the street knows she's getting some of these because she's counting how many I've made right now. I've got some proofing, some are in the oven, some are chilled and ready to go. And how about I start from that side, and we're just gonna fill. And you have to remember you wanna save the caps to your semlor. The first time Michael and I saw these cream buns was actually our very first, I shouldn't say very first, our only visit to Sweden. When did we go to Sweden? That was a long time ago. That was when my sugar cookbook came out. So that would have been 2004 or 5? Wow, 2005. And it was, I think it was just after Lent. It was definitely winter. And I remember the first time I saw them, it was actually in a coffee shop at the train station in Stockholm. And I saw them at a distance, these beautiful, topped with the cream and the little cap on top. And I just thought, I have to know what those are. And learned very quickly how delicious they are and how loved they are too. Thanks, B. And that's sadly not B for Bonnie. B saying they wished I was their neighbor. I do have some happy neighbors. I do need some of the, I scooped out a lot of the bread filling. I need more of this cream, so I'm just gonna top it up over here. Oh, Tasha's asking, can you put the bread dough inside the fridge overnight for the first proof? 100%. That's a great question. Yes, you can, if you wanna buy yourself time. And of course, anything made with a freshly baked bread is best enjoyed the day you make it. So if you wanna buy yourself a little time, well then, yes, make the dough, because all you're doing is slowing the fermentation by putting it in the fridge. You don't compromise the dough, it buys you time. So that is an excellent question to ask. I have to say, our group today, you are asking amazing baking questions. And so I'm so glad you could join me for this live stream. Now let me just, there we go. I will be back on Tuesday. I'm not taking an extra week break this time. I will be back next Tuesday. I wanted to make sure I did a live stream right before Easter in case anyone is planning some Easter style desserts or springtime ideas. got one little bit of marzipan that's kind of stuck there. There we go. Must be because it was the bottom of the bowl. There we go. And the last one. So we're not quite done yet. The last thing is those little caps you saved. Don't press them, just rest them on top. It's like how the top button on our pants feels after we eat too many of these. Just about to pop open. There we go. And then the finishing touch, a little icing sugar right on top. Ooh, and I have to show you the ones in the oven. I can smell them now. Can you smell them, Michael? I can smell the cardamom from here. So just not a heavy dusting, just a light dusting of icing sugar. And that is how you make Swedish Semlor. Look at those little gems. I just think they're adorable. And what a treat. If they're new to you or your crowd, your friends and family will be very impressed if you brought these over. Before I bite into the one, because you know then I'm going to have a mouthful of cream and won't be able to talk with my mouthful, I want to show you the buns right now. Ooh, Snow Sam's. Oh, in Winnipeg, that's why you asked the question about the Wiener Tarte, because we know Gimli is the center where the Icelanders came from Iceland and settled in Canada when it was the volcanic eruption. Michael's background is, he's Icelandic Canadian and grew up in Saskatchewan. So that's how I understand what Wiener Tarte is. Oh, Judy's asking, what am I baking up for you next week? Do you really want to know? Or do you want it to be a bit of a surprise? You know what? I'll give you, oh, and Carlene's making hot cross buns right now. Good fit. Janice is asking, does proofing in the fridge help with elevation? The air pressure is still low in the fridge, so it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Good question. Oh, and Snow's family's from Gimli, so there we go. Okay, should I give away, I'll give you a chance to weigh in. Should I give away what I am making next Tuesday when I'm back for my pre-Easter bake? In the meantime, while you think about that, I'm gonna grab the buns. Yeah, they do need a few more minutes, but you can see here they are. Look at how they've risen up. Nice and fluffy and light, and I'll have to let them fill. I might actually freeze these and then fill them fresh on another day, because how many semlor can you eat in a day? And yes, yes. Oh, no, we've got, someone says keep it a secret. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, Chris, you said keep it a secret. Close your ears. La, 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 la. You're not listening. I am going to make, it is my Baking Wisdom series, so it's going to be another recipe from my new cookbook, Baking Wisdom. And I thought for Easter and spring, a pink lemonade eaten mess would be a treat. So an eaten mess is traditionally whipped cream with strawberries and meringue all mixed together. I've got a twist. I add a lemon curd and then I color the meringue pink. And then together with the berries and the cream, it's an amazing dessert. It's gluten-free, it's easy to make, but I can walk you through the meringue techniques, lemon curd techniques, and assembly, and you will be all set. My wish, as always, is to share my years of professional baking with you, because it's not about what I can do, it's what you can do. I want you to feel confident that you can now make these Swedish Semlor and feel proud of what you've done. Make sure your friends and family also know what you've done and how much work. Baking is special because we're sharing not just a sweet treat, we're sharing the gift of our time spent in the kitchen. We enjoy it, but that is truly a gift. I thank you for giving me your time today, and I look forward to seeing you next week for another live stream. But now I've got to take a big bite of this Swedish Semlor. Okay, this is not going to be pretty. Oh, but it's pretty good. Typical to a lot of Scandinavian desserts, they pair well with strong coffee, and this would definitely pair well. The bun, I love that it's not overly sweet. Oh, there's my timer. There. So good. Thank you, everyone. For another, you just don't thaw them filled. Freeze them unfilled. See you next week, everyone. Bye. Oh, got a marzipan bite.